Today is all about you guys who are watching, you guys who are commenting and just making things so much fun doing this YouTube stuff. You guys leave some of the most incredible book recommendations down below, and I always look further into every single book that you guys recommend. I feel that you guys know me really well because quite often your comment is, if you loved that book that you just talked about for 10 minutes, you're probably going to love this book. And the truth is, I think you're right. I think a lot of the recommendations you give me are bang on and I will enjoy them. And my virtual TBR has been growing quite a bit because of it. I particularly love that a lot of you are recommending backlisted books and books that are not talked about very much, which I know is something that you tell me you enjoy that I talk about. So today I'm going to share with you some of your book recommendations that have piqued my interest and added their way into my TBR, or perhaps something that I already own and it's just escalating that, getting up to the top of my TBR. I hope that you will find a new recommendation out of this as well. So I have my laptop in front of me here and I'm going to get into it now. The first one that I wanted to talk about was one that was recommended by Alison Harris, and that is Gone with the Wind by Margaret Mitchell. I bought this a long time ago. I don't know if I'll read this copy because the text is very thick and it's hard to read, but it's a whopper. Oh gosh, it's almost 1,000 pages. But Alison recommended it by saying this: I'm in the process of listening to this right now. The story itself is historical and the characters are so well developed. For me, living in the US, it is particularly interesting because it reflects a divide within the country. The film, which I watched a long time ago, could not include much of the history of the Civil War, and that has such a strong presence within the story. I love the movie. It is something I probably watch maybe once every couple of years. It's very long, but I love watching it. And I think Alison's comment about the fact that there's more of the Civil War in here than there was in the movie does make me still want to read this. Not being American, I don't know a lot about the Civil War. It's not something we really studied in our schools. We focus much more on wars or conflicts that Australia was involved in, so I didn't learn a lot about it. What I do know is probably from books or movies that I've taken upon myself to get into. I know there's a lot of problematic stuff in here about how people are treated, and I get that, but it's hard to read these books through a modern lens. It's a bit like reading Huckleberry Finn or Tom Sawyer. If you read those books through a modern lens, you're going to have problems with it. And I think it's okay to read it, appreciate for what it was at the time, and know that we're trying to do better as an entire civilization. I think that's what I can take away from it. So I don't shy away from reading this sort of stuff, but it's definitely made its way a little bit further up, although it's 1,000 pages. So if you've read this, I'd love to hear if you recommend this just as much as Alison did, or maybe you want to add it to your TBR. The next book recommendation is from Sadie STTR, Trespasses. I read it many years ago and still think of it. If you hadn't read Trespasses by Louise Kennedy, please give it a go. She's an Irish author, which ticks a box for me because I love Irish, Scottish, Welsh, English authors are some of my favourites. I was floored emotionally by this book, certainly literary, about the troubles in Northern Ireland in the 70s. Please read the book blurb for more info about the story. Okay, Sadie, let's do that. Okay, so it was published in 2022, so it's fairly recent. A shattering novel about a young woman caught between allegiance to community and a dangerous passion. Amid daily reports of violence, Cushla lives a quiet life with her mother in a small town near Belfast. By day she teaches at school, at night she fills in at her family's pub. There she meets Michael Agnew, a barrister who's made a name for himself defending IRA members. Against her better judgment, Michael is not only Protestant but older and married. Cushla lets herself get drawn in by him and his sophisticated world, and an affair ignites. Then the father of a student is savagely beaten, setting in motion a chain reaction that will threaten everything and everyone Cushla wants to protect. As tender as it is unflinching, Trespasses is a heart-pounding, heart-wrenching drama of thwarted love and irreconcilable loyalties in a place what you come from seems to count more than what you do or whom you cherish. It says that it's literary fiction, historical fiction, and it's a fairly short read at just over 300 pages, but that sounds fascinating. My mum's family is from Ireland, and I haven't read a lot of non-fiction books, so this might be a good gateway into learning a little bit more about that period of time for Ireland, and maybe it will help me get into maybe reading a little bit more about all of that, because I do have some on my TBR that are about the conflicts in Ireland, so thanks, Sadie. The next one is from Gillian Kingston, and this is Juice by Tim Winton. I was unaware that it is a dystopian novel, but nevertheless, it's a cracking book. I will buy anything by Winton, my favourite Australian author. I have to agree with you, Gillian, but I have seen this in the bookstore and it is ginormous. It is a big doorstop of a book. And I have heard it's dystopian. Tim Winton is interesting where he has always had like an element of environmentalism in his books. So this was only just released last year. An epic novel of determination, survival, and the limits of the human spirit. This is Tim Winton as you've never read him before. Two fugitives, a man and a child, drive all night across the stony desert. As dawn breaks, they roll into an abandoned mine site. From the vehicle, they survey a forsaken place. Twisted iron, rusty wire, piles of sun-baked trash. They're exhausted, traumatized, desperate now. But as a refuge, this is the most promising place they've seen. The child peers at the field of desolation. The man thinks to himself, this could work. Problem is they're not alone. So begins a searing and propulsive journey through a life whose central challenge is not simply a matter of survival, but how to maintain human decency as everyone around you falls even further into barbarism. Oh, it's only 500 and just over 500 pages. That Gone with the Wind was ginormous, but the hardback copy looks so big. I think it sounds like a fascinating read, and I agree with you, Gillian. I love reading. I've got a backlog of Tim Winton books to get through, but he is reliably good. The way he tells a story is so good. He creates these really multi-dimensional characters and has such a way of making the story accessible. You don't feel like the writing is too verbose or complicated. It's very, very easy to read, and he really does immerse you into it. So I agree with you. I think I want to read this as well. So thank you for recommending it. Now, the next one, a lot of you have recommended, and that is The Salt Path by Raynor Winn, which clearly I do have. I actually have Landlines as well on my bookshelf. I did buy that before The Salt Path, but I want to read them, both of them. And I think a lot of you have suggested this because you know that I love authors from the United Kingdom. I love nature writing, books that have an element of the environment in them, which this does. And what was incredible was one of you recently actually said, hey, Ange, I know that you talked about buying The Salt Path a while ago, but I don't think I've seen you say that you've read it. So when are you going to read it? And I thank you for keeping me accountable. I think the reason why I haven't read this yet is because it has themes around illness. In this book, Raynor Winn's husband has just been diagnosed with a terminal illness. And I think with those subjects, I am being very conscious of not reading too much in one go. It's definitely like a 1 in 10 kind of book. After I've read a few other ones, then I'll come back to a book that might deal a bit with grief, with illness, these things that I have experienced with in the very recent past. Even when I did watch Apple Cider Vinegar, which is the dramatization of the Mel Gibson scam of the century. And even watching that and watching people go through cancer diagnosis and treatment, that was very raw, and I nearly had to stop watching it and just give myself some space to breathe through it. So for that reason, I'm very conscious of it, and so I haven't read it for that reason just yet. But I have recently seen a trailer come out for the movie, which has Gillian Anderson, so of course I want to watch that, so I need to read this book a little bit sooner. So hopefully you'll see me say, hey, I finally read it in the next few months. Next is a recommendation from Dr. Hannah Short called 15 Wild Decembers. She wrote, in terms of recommendations, I adored 15 Wild Decembers by Karen Powell. It's a retelling of Emily Bronte's life, and I am here for that. Okay, it came out in 2023, so it's very recent. This sounds really interesting, and it says it was nominated for a literary award, and I think it sounds amazing, so thank you, Hannah. I will be adding that to my TBR. The next recommendation is from 4 Pots Light 169. You Missed the Living by Annie Dilliard. And I think this might have been when I was talking about my ins and outs for 2025. You Missed the Living by Annie Dilliard. Sweeping multi-generational epic about the westward migration and settlement of Oregon. Some of the most beautiful prose I've ever read. I added that to my TBR immediately. I absolutely love these stories of families who are doing hard stuff in hard terrain and making a go of it, you know? So I definitely added that one to my TBR quickly afterwards. So it was published in 1992. 90 miles north of Seattle on the Washington coast lies Bellingham Bay, where a rough settlement founded in the 1850s would become the town of Whatcom. Here, the Lumni and Nooksack Indian people fish and farm, hermits pay their debt in sockeye salmon, and miners track gold-bearing streams. Here, too, is the intimate murderous tale of 3 men. Ooh. Claire Fishburne believes that greatness lies in store for him. John Ireland Sharp, an educated orphan, abandons hope when he sees socialists expel the Chinese workers from the region. Beale Obenchain, who lives in a cedar stump, threatens Claire Fishburne's life. A killer lashes a Chinese worker to a wharf pole at low tide. Settlers pour in to catch the boom the railroads bring. People give birth, drown, burn, inherit rich legacies, and commit expensive larcenies. All this takes place 100 years ago when these vital, ruddy men and women were the living. That sounds fascinating. Yeah, I'm there for that. So thank you so much, Four Pots Life, for recommending that book. I think, I'm going to get into that one. The next recommendation is from MSK-JD5FI, The Lindbergh Nanny. Check out books by Mariah Fredericks, specifically The Lindbergh Nanny and The Wharton Plot. She wrote a series of novels about a fictional lady's maid who had to solve several crimes, but the two I mentioned are about historical events and people. I know a little bit about the Lindberghs, and in particular their child that went missing and all of the conspiracy theories that were surrounding that at the time. So it is something I think I would really like to read. But the author, Mariah Fredericks, the fact that she's written a number of books with this vein of mystery and some that are based on true facts, I think sounds really interesting. So thank you so much for that recommendation. This one was interesting. This is from Shelly Sanders Wright, who is an author, and she recommended her own book called Daughters of the Occupation. As a historical fiction author of Daughters of the Occupation from 2022, that received a starred Kirkus review, was a Canadian bestseller, and is inspired by my own discovery of my Latvian Jewish roots, I truly appreciate readers shining a light on those less mentioned books. So I don't think she was giving me a specific recommendation, but she was just sharing that information. And then I saw someone commented on Shelley's comment saying, I have your book on my TBR and I can't wait to read it. So I looked into what this book was, and it sounds very interesting about an era that we know a lot about, but perhaps a specific group or a community of people that haven't had their story told. Just got to say, this book has over 2,500 ratings and it is a 4.23 star on Goodreads. Inspired by true events in World War II Latvia, an emotionally charged novel of sacrifice, trauma, resilience and survival as witnessed by 3 generations of women. I think I really love those intergenerational discussions where you have families and you have this entire family story being told. I really, really love those. And I would recommend you go have a look at this blurb. It's quite long, so I won't read it. But it basically says that it's a magnificent, emotionally powerful story of family and the lingering devastation of war. The Daughters of the Occupation explores how trauma is passed down in families and illuminates the strength and grace that can be shared by generations. It's historical fiction for a community that I haven't read any books about that were affected by this. I really would like to read it, and I think my mum would like that book. The next recommendation is from Auntie Nia, 1989, called The Colour by Rose Tremain, which is about the gold rush in New Zealand. I have seen this book around and I have heard it before. I've been recommended this. I think my mum maybe recommended it to me. But it is historical fiction set in New Zealand around the gold rush period. Now, I have a connection to New Zealand. My dad was from New Zealand. I still have family there. I got married there. I have a strong connection to New Zealand and everything it encompasses. So I would love to read a little bit of historical fiction based in that area. Newlyweds Joseph and Harriet Blackstone emigrate from England to New Zealand along with Joseph's mother, Lillian, in search of new beginnings and prosperity. But the harsh land near Christchurch where they settle threatens to destroy them almost before they begin. When Joseph finds gold in a creek bed, he hides the discovery from both his wife and mother and becomes obsessed with the riches awaiting him deep in the earth. Abandoning his farm and family, he sets off alone for the new goldfields over the Southern Alps, a moral wilderness where many others, under the seductive charm of the colour, rush to their destinies and doom. I think it sounds amazing. It's from 2003. I could not tell you the last historical fiction book I read that had New Zealand as a location, so I really appreciate that recommendation that you brought that back to my memory. Thank you very much. I've got 4 more recommendations. This next one was actually recommended by a couple of people, and that was Reading is Like Breathing and Barbara Paig, and they recommended Margaret George, in particular one of her books. Margaret George is a marvellous author. She writes long novels, but it flies by because it is such good writing. I have read her books on Henry VIII and Mary, Queen of Scots. Both sent me down a rabbit hole of books about the Tudors. Haven't gotten to the Cleopatra book yet, but I'm sure it will be good. But this book, Cleopatra, caught my attention. Wow, she has an incredible back catalogue. Helen of Troy, Mary Magdalene, Elizabeth I, Nero, Mary Queen of Scots, and the Memoirs of Cleopatra, which is the one I was interested in. This is rated 4.19 stars on Goodreads, and it has over 20,000 ratings, so I think that's a pretty good hit rate. It was published in 1997. I know a lot about Cleopatra's life, the narrative we've been told, but to have different people tell the story is always really interesting. And this is just saying it's the best kind of historical novel, one the reader can't wait to get lost in. So I think I really would love to read that. And I'm very interested in maybe reading the Helen of Troy one as well. That's really quite cool. So thank you very much, Breathing is Like Reading and Barbara Paig, for recommending that author and that book. These next 3 are quite fun because these are very much, if you read this, you'll like this, which I love those sort of things. This is from Nanima Onovi, and it's called The Egg and I, and they wrote, if you like 84 Charing Cross Road, pick up Betty MacDonald. The Egg and I is easiest to find secondhand because there was a movie. Her whole quartet is funny and poignant. There are a few outdated terms. She was born in 1927. I don't mind that. I don't mind reading books that are of their time, so I'm there for that. But The Egg and I, if someone says if you like 84 Charing Cross Road, you will like this book, I'm definitely gonna read it because I loved that book. The next one is from Margaret Pinnard, and she recommends Bedlam Stacks. The Fair Botanist makes me think you might like Bedlam Stacks. Have you read? One of my favourites. I have not read it, and I am looking forward to it. So I think I found it. The Bedlam Stacks by Natasha Pulley, published in 2012. This is not the synopsis I thought it was going to be. In 1859, ex-India Company smuggler Merrick Tremain is trapped at home in Cornwall with an injury that almost cost him his leg. While the India office recruits him for an expedition to fetch quinine, essential for the treatment of malaria from deep within Peru, he knows it's a terrible idea. Historical fiction, magical realism. There's this one 5-star review. You know that bit in Pride and Prejudice 2005 with the hand flex and then the deleted end scene where he calls her Mrs. Darcy and they kiss? That's how this book makes me feel. I'm there. I am there. I want to read this book. It sounds like so much fun. So thank you, Margaret, for that recommendation. And the last recommendation I have is from Geraldine Rowe, and that is for Diary of a Nobody. This is a backlisted book. She wrote, if you enjoy 3 Men in a Boat, you might also like Diary of a Nobody by George and Weedon Grossmith. It's by 2 people. Similar Victorian humour. It's my comfort book. I've read it countless of times. It is by 2 people, George Grossmith and Weedon Grossmith. It was published in 1892. Mr. Pooter is a man of modest ambitions, content with his ordinary life, yet he always seems to be troubled by disagreeable tradesmen, impertinent young office clerks and wayward friends. Not to mention his devil-may-care son Lupin and his unsuitable choice of bride. Try as he might, he cannot avoid life's embarrassing mishaps. In the bumbling, absurd, yet ultimately endearing figure of Pooter, the Grossmiths created an immortal comic character and a superb satire on the snobberies of middle-class suburbia. So it says that it is classics, fiction, humour. It sounds like a lot of fun, and published in 1892. And it's very small. It's like about the same length as 3 Men in a Boat. It's like it's like around 170 pages. But I think that one sounds like a lot of fun. So I hope you enjoyed this little dip into the comments where people were recommending books for me, but the fact that you were watching these videos makes me think that you would like them too because you like what I read and you're enjoying it, and that's what I hear you saying. So thank you everyone for your book recommendations. Thank you all for leaving your recommendations. Thank you for commenting and liking and sharing the videos. I really do appreciate it. And I hope that maybe you got 1 or 2 recommendations out of this list. As always, I hope you have a wonderful week of reading ahead, and I will see you soon. Bye.